listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
Good. I just got done applying the iOS 14.8, I believe. And so yesterday you said, it's almost 4 o'clock. Get ready to install the iOS update. And I was thinking, I'm not going to get to that. And then I realized that, it fixes two critical 0-day vulnerabilities in iOS. Very important. So for everyone who's listening, if you have iOS devices and who doesn't, you need to get this installed. I know this episode isn't going to air until September 27th, so it's going to be kind of old hat by then. But if you have it installed, and the other thing is, Jeff, we live in this nerd world where we know about these things, right? And it still might be 24 hours until I install. But think about other people in your lives who have these devices who just think these updates are a huge hassle, and the only reason they would install the update is for new functionality. But I think on that thread also, Apple's had kind of a rough year with some of these 0-day vulnerabilities coming out. I mean, there are like six to eight major 0-day vulnerabilities that have been released against iOS this year.
Yeah, Apple certainly struggled with it. Obviously, Microsoft with the Exchange stuff and other things that happen. So if you're listening to this, right, it's theoretically September 27th, which means, I'm sorry, Jim, but 14.8 is already out of date because 15 is coming out on the 20th. So this coming Monday from when we're recording. So definitely you want to probably upgrade if you can at that point. I constantly have to remind my wife to upgrade her phone, even though she knows that she should be doing it. I think part of it is the tedium of doing it because, if it's like anything like in this house, right, we've got phones, tablets, watches, Macs, everything seems to want to get updated on the same day. And it takes some coordination to kind of make sure that everything gets updated and that you're not in this black hole of, oh my gosh, I don't have my phone or my tablet or something where I can actually look at a screen for 2 minutes and have to look outside. We don't want to have that happen, right? So something to think about.
Well, yeah, you also have to budget the right amount of time. Like if you have a conference call starting in 15 minutes is not the time to install your iOS update, because I think it took, at least 20 minutes to install, if not a half an hour.
Yeah, you want to not do that right before the call, because even if it was only going to take 1 minute in the real world, as soon as you had that call scheduled, something's going to go wrong and it's going to totally impact it. So yeah, don't do it during prime hours. I guess that's the message.
You have to make sure you ask our guest today, is she an Apple or an Android?
I think I know the answer already, just because we can see her staring at us intently on the screen here, and I've already seen what her phone looks like as we were kind of doing the prep for this. But why don't we go ahead and get into it? So, this is definitely not the Apple podcast and talking about iOS or anything like that. We talk about identity here, and the topic for today is really around the convergence of risk and identity. So specifically things like third-party risk, insider risk, and identity risks that are associated with it. And how does that affect things like the workforce, and how does IAM drive that? So to help us with the conversation today, we've got Jen Kraxner. She's a director of strategic advisory at SecZetta. Welcome to the show, Jen.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. Let's hit Jim's question first before we get to your IAM origin story. Is it iOS or Android for you?
It is iOS. Yes, I converted. It's not been, I wasn't an early adopter, but probably 5 years ago or so, switched to my iPhone for sure.
So you're a blue texter now. So welcome to that club, I guess. I know that some people, think that is a status symbol for whatever reason.
Yep.
Let's talk about your identity background, because one of the things that we always like to explore is, how did you get into the identity world? Is it something you chose? Did it choose you? Or maybe, as my brother has recently pointed out, when did you realize you were actually in identity and access management? And maybe we can start there.
I like that. I think I was definitely I just kind of found out that's what I was doing now. If I go all the way back to the beginning, my career actually started as a counterintelligence agent, which I don't think at the time I ever would have, dreamt that that would lead me to identity. But I did that at a very interesting time, specifically just over 20 years ago, which we know we just recently kind of commemorated the 20th anniversary of September 11th, which was an interesting time to be in that in that occupation as a counterintelligence agent. But I did a lot in that sense around risk, and I actually did a lot around identity, although I didn't realize it at the time. It was just more around national security and more from that perspective. But from there, I kind of took a very kind of winding path through different things like software development and project management and teaching. Landed at a help desk for a little while as an IT admin, and then eventually worked on an operational support team doing identity and access management. It was not something that I had intended to jump into. It was almost helping a friend who needed some people to fill a role. But I like to say that it got me to the point where I walked the walk for a while, because I was essentially um, fielding help desk tickets from people to request access and to build new AD groups and to define new roles for access requests. So I was kind of doing the work of these help tickets. But so I say I walked the walk, but I felt the pain too for a very long time. And from there, I migrated into a advisory consultant role where I started talking to other organizations about their programs and their processes and what do they do from an identity perspective and an access management perspective, and tried to help them improve those processes for end users, for improved cybersecurity, for better efficiency, for enablement. I mean, for all of the things that identity does for organizations. That was really that was when I discovered that I was doing identity, was when I was starting to really advise around it. And that's been almost 10 years ago. So yeah, it was an accident, definitely, to end up here, but I'm thrilled that that my path led me here for sure.
And now you're with SecZetta. I guess tell me a little about your current role. So when I say director of strategic advisory, and this is for obviously a software vendor in this space. Well, maybe not obviously. People may not be aware of what SecZetta does. We don't want to make this into a commercial, but maybe for 30 seconds, tell us what SecZetta is, and then what is the role that you fill for that?
Sure, yeah. So SecZetta, in a nutshell, is focused on third-party identity and risk. And I like to say, at its most basic sense, we are a non-employee system of record. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. But my role there really is as an advisor to our customers, potential customers, partners, to help folks understand the third-party gap that exists, some of the risk around third parties and identities, and how that can be addressed. Really exposing the gap, number one, and then talking about how SecZetta addresses the gap, and really helps to improve the way that third parties are handled within an organization and the risk mitigation that happens for them.
And you piqued my interest, obviously, when you talked about your time working with the U.S. Department of Defense as a counterintelligence investigator, which I got to say, very cool. And I add them on any type of LinkedIn bio that whenever I read it, I guess, is there anything, cool or interesting that you can kind of share about your time when you were, in that role?
Oh, I could probably go on and on. I will tell you my favorite thing that I did in that role was really around. It's centered around. I did some executive protection for a while, beyond even investigations, and as part of doing executive protection, we got to go through some driving training, and I like to say it was offensive driving training, but in a little different way. I guess it's offensive driving training. So we had to learn how to do things like race or do J turns or bootleg turns. And so we got to kind of go out on this really great uh, racetrack in West Virginia and take some Caprice classics out and hit the e-brake to do different different turns and chase people. And that was probably the coolest thing I got to do, I got to say.
That sounds awesome. I just imagine you like, drifting around corners and
That's exactly it. Yeah, I would go do it again. I would pay to do it again. I would just go do this week-long training if I had any opportunity to.
well, people do pay, right? I mean, there's people who go to the track on the weekends and burn out their tires over the course of a day or
They
two.
do. They do.
And you also do some work with the Identity Defined Security Alliance. We've had, Julie on the show several times at this point, and we've had some other folks who've done some work. But I guess what's your involvement with them?
Yeah, I've worked quite a bit with the IDSA, particularly in my capacity with SecZetta, and I think it's a big part of it is bringing awareness to non-employees as identities at organizations. But a lot of the work that I've done there is help guiding some of the best practices. I've worked with some of the technical working groups there around some foundational aspects, and also provided a guest blog actually, which was recently kind of posted back up on LinkedIn. Is exciting for me. It was around really authoritative data, the importance of it, and how that can really be key to a successful identity program.
Yeah, and we'll have a link to that blog in our show notes here for people to check out, because I did see that as well, and it just happened to be coincidental that we're going to be talking today. It wasn't even anything that I had planned, but when I read it, there was one thing that stuck out, and I want to kind of just read this one part and kind of tease it, because I think this is really important that a lot of people don't pick up on, and that is, so just reading from the blog, one very important yet often overlooked component is that you trust the data you have about these identities, whether they are employees, contractors, customers, partners, or non-humans. And not just that you trust it at the point in time the identity is onboarded, but you must trust it consistently throughout the identity's lifecycle. And I think that last part there is the part that's really important is, yeah, just because it got into a system of record doesn't mean that it's going to be correct to the end of time unless there are processes or controls in place to kind of validate that Jeff is still who he says he is, and that Jen still is, and that, maybe she's still working for the Department of Defense and still can take driving classes whenever. Maybe that was true, a while back, and maybe not true anymore. Can you talk a little bit about maybe just that one specific point of making sure that authoritative data is really kept up to date at all times and not just that single point in time when it's entered into the system?
Absolutely. I think a lot of times organizations take it for granted that the data they have is maintained, and that's because we're quite reliant on employee data, right, and HR data to drive a lot of identity processes, and that's fantastic because we can generally trust that our employee data is maintained. But when we think about some of the processes that exist for other populations of people and the way that they get access quite often, which is quite often via something like a help desk ticket. And we might very well trust that all the information submitted in that request is accurate upon submission. But as soon as that, access gets created, that identity gets created, that person is onboarded, we don't have typically a trusted source to go back to make sure that that data is all still accurate, a year from now or 2 years from now, or even 3 months from now, in the case of a contractor coming in to do, a short-term engagement with an organization. So there has to be a trusted source that's also accessible, maintained, and yeah, just, like the blog said, like I said in the blog, something that we know we can rely on, no matter if it was entered in, no matter if that person was onboarded a week ago or onboarded a month ago or 3 years ago.
So, Jen, Jeff mentioned early in the podcast that we're going to talk about third-party risk. So, if you don't mind, I'd like to take an opportunity to see if I could define third-party risk. So, it goes something like this: you're at the second party, you have too many beers to drink, and you try some of your dad jokes, and they're going really well. So then you figure, when I get to the third party, I'm going to tell all of my dad jokes.
You nailed it. That's perfect. I'd like to hear an example of one of these dad jokes. I'm putting you on the spot.
You really put me on the spot. That whole line that I just said, that was everything I had prepared.
Well, did you hear the one about the sheet of paper?
I don't think so.
It's terrible.
Here's what I
That's
like.
my only dad joke. That's my only dad joke.
I'm afraid of the calendar. Its days are numbered.
Ooh. Ba-dum-bum.
Ba-dum-bum.
All right, so I guess comedy hour's over. Jen, maybe you can give us an idea of what you're talking about with third-party risk, what it is in the real world, and then what's the identity management tie-in?
Yeah. So, as identity professionals, I always think about the fact that I have one idea of risk when I work in identity. And it typically is not the third party version. We all really think a lot about access risk and identity risk and those sorts of things. Third party risk is somewhat siloed generally. I think we're working to change some of that. But third party risk can center around a lot of different things. For example, as what I call a host organization, somebody who's engaging a third party to do some work for them. We spend quite a bit of time often vetting that third party. There are teams that do third party risk assessments, right? There are security questionnaires that are filled out to understand what is this third party's security practices. How do they operate as an organization? What's the risk that they're bringing to us, not only from a cybersecurity standpoint, but potentially even from a reputational standpoint, from a business resiliency standpoint. Has this third party been around for a long time? Can we be sure that when we pay them to do something for us, they're going to be here next year to fulfill that? There are a lot of pieces that go into third party risk. And I think what I would say is a lot of that evaluation that happens at the organizational level for third parties is really valuable, right? It's incredibly valuable detail, but it kind of just lives there quite often. And the consideration, the thing that I really want people to start thinking about is, why aren't we using this information that we have to affect how we treat these non-employees or third-party workers that are coming in and doing things for us, and the access that we give them, or how we consider, whether they even get a certain type of access, or how that access should be monitored, or how frequently we should validate that they're still even active on a project, for example. So I think there are a lot of ways that you can use third-party risk information to influence identity and access that we just haven't really taken full advantage of yet.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about when you're thinking about third party risks, whether you're really talking about from an identity standpoint, human identity, or also including machine identity. But I wanted to kind of segue or sidetrack for a second and mention I was looking at the Gartner hype cycle that was just released the other day, and machine identity management is in the peak of inflated expectations, which sounds really horrible. Right? It's like right behind decentralized identity. I mean, I just feel like some of these names are just incredible. The next section in the hype cycle is the trough of disillusionment. In that includes bring your own identity, SaaS delivered IAM, and API access control. Those are in the trough of disillusionment, which to me, those seem like pretty mature areas of IAM. And anyway, so that's a total sidetrack. But as I thought about that question, I wanted to bring that up because, and Jeff, if we can put the link in the show notes for that hype cycle. It's a lot to read, but um, anyway, I thought that was super interesting. So that question back to you, Jen. Um, as far as the third party risks, are we focused on just human identities, or would non human identities also kind of fit in that mix?
100% non-human identities would fix in there, or non-human workers, right? I think that it's very nuanced in some cases how you reference things, and honestly, I know I talk to a lot of people, and even myself included, when I first started having conversations about non-human things, trying to really understand what is that and what are we even talking about. But if you're thinking about bots or devices or, applications even, or RPA, all of these things that kind of fit that non-human realm, why would we treat them any differently than any other identity, as far as understanding the risk that they pose? As far as, if you think about it, there are process automation vendors that we're getting these bots from, right? So that bot is that third party vendor's worker. It's just that it's non-human. And I think that there are definitely times when we need to be able to apply the risk from that vendor to that thing. But I also think, um, kind of on a side note here, that when we consider identity and access in general, it seems like employee populations have always been a little bit further ahead than some of these other things that we're talking about, whether that's non-employees and third parties, which non-employees can encompass a lot of things, from contractors and vendors to partners and affiliates to agencies or agents, independent agents or franchise workers. There are a slew of people that we don't put in our HR system and don't effectively maintain and track. And all of those populations are a little bit further behind employees, and generally because of that key piece of authoritative data and authoritative source for those identities. We trust that we have that for employees. We're getting to the point, a little bit better point, where we have that for at least part of our contractor and vendor populations. There's a ways to go still, but non-humans are even a step behind, I feel. I think that we are at a point now where we are managing non-humans in a way that's very account focused. We're kind of getting them to the identity piece, but we're kind of way down there. And what is the authoritative system or authoritative source for a non-human? I think that's a really important question to ask, and a really important piece of the conversation when it comes to non-employees, that we're talking about.
You're touching on an area that I'm pretty passionate about. You're talking about B2B in a lot of ways, right? So you're talking about the example you use with agencies, or I think in a previous conversation you used the example of franchisees. So a lot of times those are considered part of a customer IAM scenario, but in other organizations it could be an internal IAM scenario. And there are not many systems out there that specialize in the management of, the delegated management to a B2B, we call them partner or customer or what have you. So again, we don't use this as a platform for being an infomercial, but is that something that's in the wheelhouse of what you guys do?
100%. When I say SecZetta is a non-employee system of record, that encompasses all non-employees. We're trying to fill this gap because it exists for everybody in a number of different ways. And that is the gap that if we don't have an HR system that we can trust uh, to provide us accurate data about identities that need to be created. So if we don't have an authority for those identities, we need to make one, and we need to trust it. We need to put processes and workflows in place that allow us to be confident that that data about those identities is being maintained and is trustworthy. And that's exactly it's not only what we do, it is the exact reason we were built as a solution in the first place.
I want to talk a little bit about those authoritative sources, because I think that's an area that, frankly, is a little bit of an I am holy war. And we've talked about this before on previous episodes. But before I forget, I did have another good dad joke. What do you call a factory that makes okay products? A satisfactory. And I
You
got to
Oh,
even
use my
got
little
the
sound
sound
pad
effect.
finally.
yeah,
All right.
finally.
I
Finally,
love
it only
it.
took 50 episodes to get to it. So let's talk about non-employee authoritative sources, because, like I said, I think this is definitely one of the I am holy wars. You have a couple of different camps here, right? You've got employees being well managed; they have an HR system, and HR teams are typically, all on board, right? That's what we do. We manage our employees. Then you have your non-employees, and those can be managed any number of ways. It could be managed by the HR team, it could be managed by a finance team, it could be managed by IT because no one else is doing it. There could be no management for them, right? Maybe everyone just kind of lives in a spreadsheet, or they go right into Active Directory and there really isn't any governance around it. I guess I'd love to hear your take on this I am holy war, just because, in our, at least in my experience, HR tends not to want to own and manage that population, and it's such a foundational component of any identity program to be able to know who has access to what. You have to be able to answer the who part at least consistently. I guess what's your take on that? Because you guys have obviously filled this niche of non-employee identity. I would imagine because you're seeing the same problem, right? There's a lack of ownership within an organization for that population.
Yes, exactly. And you're absolutely right. HR teams push back on owning non-employees, and for good reason, right? They're not their processes aren't built to maintain them. Their systems, HR systems aren't built to maintain non-employee records or non-employee processes. And eh, I'll tell you, there's one component of this, which is just the day-to-day responsibility and assuming that responsibility of being the owner of these records. And of course, HR has generally, in most enterprises, has plenty to do that they don't need to take on an increasing number of non-employees. And by the way, what HR team is ever going to say, yeah, tell me when you want to create a new bot and we'll put it in our system so that we can track it, right? But they just don't want to do it any more than I would say an IT team wants to do it or a help desk wants to do it, although that's who it generally falls to, right? I would say the majority of organizations have a ticketing system that's managing their contractor onboarding, for example. But I would also say that most frequently, in my experience, organizations are doing a combination of many things to manage non-employees, and partly because there are such varied populations of them. So HR might be involved with some contingent workers, for example, but um, you know, a new IT service vendor that comes on goes straight into Active Directory. So it's so spread out, but it's justifiable, number one, that HR doesn't want to do it, because they are not in and of themselves the authority on those people. They don't have the processes to collect all the information. Um, it's very decentralized when it comes to most non-employees. And, I would also say there are a lot of reasons that these non-employees should not be put into an HR system. First and foremost, that the HR systems aren't built to maintain the information or the processes for them, right? Um, Quite often, we're not supposed to collect social security numbers, right, for contractors, or a lot of information that's required in an HR system. Just bottom line can't be collected about non-employee people.
Every once in a while, I'll hear the term co-employment come up as a concern that HR teams will have, where, for those not familiar, basically it's treating a non-employee the same as an employee, whereas the from a legal definition, and you're starting to see this a little bit like Uber and Lyft and some of these other kind of contractor based businesses, where the individual, if you're treating them like an employee, they must be an employee, and then that means there is some sort of legal, rights that that potential person might have. So I hear awful lot. Well, if we put them on our HR system, then that's going to, demonstrate co-employment, which means now they become an employee, and that's a whole different area that we want to be in. And I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, because I think, a lot of modern HR systems have adopted, you know, ways to manage non-employees. This is not like this is a new thing. It's been around forever. Um, but I guess, to flip it on its head, when is co-employment a valid reason not to put a contractor in an HR system? Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, I will fess up. I was as guilty as the next person, you know, in early in my advisory career, of going in and talking to organizations and saying, "Oh, tell me about your employee onboarding processes and how they get access and so on and so forth. And then jumping to now tell me about everybody else that gets access, contractors, contingent workers, whoever that may be. And when I would get the answer, well, they live in the spreadsheet or they go over here, they go over there, and we're getting ready to implement an IGA solution. Um, I would say, hey, why don't you put those people in your HR system? Like, that's going to make things so much easier for us. That's at least we'll have that authoritative data to hook up so that it can drive this program that we're trying to build for them. I now know that co-employment is a real risk. Worker misclassification is a real risk. It's not cut and dry necessarily to say, hey, I'm doing these exact things, and that removes my risk of engaging a contractor and it being considered co-employment or worker misclassification. And I got to that point in one sense because of one particular customer that I did a project and engagement with that happened to be a law firm that was one of their focuses was employment law. And when I made the suggestion that maybe they should think about putting these people in their HR system, they said not only no, but hell no. And they said, we have seen too many times where this comes back to bite somebody. And in fact, these guys would go so far as to, not even populate a manager field in any system that might be tracking something about a contractor, whether that's Active Directory or the homegrown database they were using to put these people in. They would not call their identifier an employee ID or even an EID, right? They went to such great lengths to do everything they could to make sure that it never looked like that person was being treated as an employee. And not because there are written rules that say don't put this person in your HR system or don't call their sponsor a manager. It's not like there's a rule out there about that, but it is ammunition for somebody that might come after them about co-employment. And it's if there's a system out there, number one, I mean, the co-employment risk, the worker misclassification risk, the potential for liability and damages and all of the things that come with someone complaining about that, that's one piece of the problem with putting non-employees in HR. But even beyond that, there are significant cost implications. There are significant implications about the fact that, we have 20 different types of non-employees that we might be managing. And we've talked about agents. We've talked about franchise workers. We've talked about contractors. We haven't even covered, healthcare and physicians and traveling nurses and volunteers and all of these people. Is an HR solution going to come up with buckets to put all of these different people in to make sure they're being treated appropriately? Typically not without a whole lot of customization and work, right? So there's a lot that goes into that conversation. But when it comes right down to co-employment specifically, that engagement with that law firm was the eye-opener for me. And it stuck with me from that point on.
I've been thinking about the different sources of risk and kind of what makes a person or an identity risky. I think that's what we're really getting at here, right? Is um, somebody who comes in who is working in the cafeteria is less risk than the non-employee system administrator, or even you know, you hire two system administrators at the same time. Maybe one of them is in some kind of financial ruin in their personal life, or has some kind of sketchy background or something like that. But, I'm wondering, is that the kind of risk that you're talking about? And kind of talk to us a little bit about, if it is, how that can be used to, drive what people have access to.
That's a great point and a great question. So, I mean, we've already just today in the last, half hour, however long it's been, talked about a handful of different kinds of risk, right? We're typically very focused on something like cyber risk and identity risk from a cybersecurity and breach perspective, obviously. And there's, I would never downplay that as an important consideration. And I think that that's got to really be number one when it comes to identities and the access that they're given. So things like considering what organization, if we're thinking non-employees specifically, right? And even take it down more specific than that, a consultant or a contractor. Let's look at, number one, how risky is the organization they come from? Because all the effort that goes into defining that third-party risk really uncovers potentially some very valuable information, right? Like security practices, like whether these folks have gone through a background check. Just like you said, if there's anything sketchy in their background, then maybe they just don't hire them. So we can understand a lot about a person based on that. However, there are absolutely other contributing factors, right? You have to think about, Jim, like you said, what job function are they providing for us? What are they even doing for us as a host organization? And that 100% should contribute to what we would talk about as a person's identity risk. Are they working on site or are they purely remote? That could also, or what location, period, are they working from? That should potentially impact the risk that that person presents to an organization. Things like whether they've completed security awareness training, right? Whether they've been known to have poor security practices. Did they fall for that phishing attempt, that came through a couple days ago? Some of these things are very applicable to the risk that a third-party identity can bring to an organization. And they can directly impact things like the, possibility and potential for a breach. But if we think about risk in an even broader sense, we've talked about other forms of risk already today, right? We've talked about worker misclassification risk, right? And while that might not need to necessarily affect the access someone's getting, it certainly should affect the types of reviews and the types of the way that we treat that person at a life cycle perspective. So understanding, hey, these things we know about this person that we're engaging for this project might increase the risk that we have for co-employment. Things like we're requiring that they come on site. Things like we made them go through our company training. We provided them equipment. So there are things that you can track throughout the life cycle of a contractor that's coming in and out. If you have that authoritative record, that can also contribute to how risky is this person from a co-employment perspective. How risky is this person from a reputation perspective? Or, it's in an interesting way, like you can pull out credentialing, licensure, whether they've gone through security. I mean, all of these pieces can absolutely contribute to a risk score or multiple risk scores that apply to all of these different types of risk that should definitely impact what kind of access are we giving this person? How are we controlling that access? How are we governing it? How are we reviewing it? How are we treating that third-party organization even? If we look at the fact that we have a dozen people, all of these people that are at our organization from this third party have a high identity individual risk score, should that maybe impact how we're treating and assessing the third party, the higher third party organization that they're coming from? I mean, there are so many pieces of this that can and should drive process in so many different areas, as long as we can aggregate it all together and get good visibility to it and track it and trust it.
I feel like this is one of the areas where, there's so many now systems that are tracking risk, right? We've got sometimes IGA platforms have it built in. Sometimes your authentication platform has risk built in. And you talked about aggregating these, and now we're talking about maybe an authoritative source has a risk function built into it, right? I guess when you have these multiple systems, what is there any type of best practice or suggestion or recommendation for people to think about of how do we collapse all this risk? Because I feel like what happens a lot of times is, okay, we know that we have a conditional authentication rule in Microsoft, and that's one risk. And then maybe someone's going into SailPoint or Savient or Omada and making an access request, and that triggers some sort of segregation of duty violation, and that's another risk, right? And now we're talking about the actual authoritative source of the identity. Is it a contractor? Is it an employee? Are they on-site, remote? is their location in one country versus another as another point of risk. I guess, what are your thoughts on collapsing or figuring out how do you combine all this stuff to make one risk score? Is that realistic? Or are there different ways that people should be thinking about it?
I think my main goal is just for people to think about it, right? I think, and don't silo these things. That this is all incredibly valuable information, and unfortunately, it is siloed, right? It's important to understand if somebody is, you know, uh, failing has multiple attempts to authenticate, right? And it happens all the time. And maybe we're tracking on something like that in an access management system or somewhere, and they can alert off of it, uh, and we can take action on it, and that's fantastic. But it stops there quite often, and we don't end up feeding that back up so that we have a broader view at the identity or person level that these events happen, and that maybe this person is more risky because of it. So I would say our goal is to take as many sources as we can, from the third party risk score to understanding the access risk. Hey, this person has access to these multiple privileged systems. That kind of a risk. We want to include that on an individual's risk score, so that it can inform another system, that if they're requesting access to something, and we need to understand, hey, they're requesting access to this, but keep in mind these other two things have put this person at a higher risk. Let's require additional approvals, right? Just to know it. And I that's the one of the biggest gaps that I see when it comes to any kind of risk and identity, is we kind of have this one focus area that we're looking at, instead of trying to look at it all as a whole, and hopefully have an authority for identities that gives us all of that information. And that's, for every customer it's different. What's risky to all of our customers varies. Certainly there are you know ideas and best practices and baselines that we suggest, and that many of our partners, our partners can really talk through with customers. But just understanding that it needs to happen, I think, is the first step. Just understanding that it all exists.
I feel like that could be its own show, and I know we want to try to wrap things up here in a minute, but I feel like this is an area that is of ripe opportunity for software vendors to figure out how to speak the same language when it comes to risk. At least come up with some commonality or something to be able to have these things interoperate, more efficiently, and maybe help your customers out with, hey, here's some best practices to translate what does this risk and authentication mean versus authorization versus authoritative source or whatever it may be. Jen, you've been so great with your time. Is there anything you want to add on to that one before we go?
Yeah, the only thing that I'd love to point out is, and again, not aiming to make this a commercial for SecZetta, but I will point out that's a really big piece of why a separate authoritative system for, sometimes identities in general should exist outside of an HR system, is because SecZetta approaches identity from the point of view of risk, right? We put in place ways to aggregate those risk scores. We put in place ways to give visibility to it, number one, but also to allow all of that risk to inform and influence much better made decisions in other systems about access and so forth. So
Yeah, I think Jen's making a good point there. I mean, you could not, I could not see an HR system sending over a feed of, here are the employees, and oh, by the way, this employee is kind of risky. It's just not
right.
something you would expect to see. But I also see a great point that Jeff's making, right? Is that, if you kind of take this identity at the center philosophy, it's taking inputs from all of your security systems, some of them IAM systems, some of them other security systems like DLP, but you're aggregating all this information and then being able to take action on it. I think the same thing needs to be done with this risk scoring, where somehow you're making sense of all these um, data points coming in, and you're able to make something that is now actionable. So, in other words, hey, we're getting triggers from our authoritative source that this person is high risk. Oh, and they've now done some things in access management like um, reset their password. That's high risk. And the privileged access management system or something else is telling us, they accessed 2,000 IP addresses yesterday. It might be time to temporarily disable that account. I don't know. But you know, that's the one great thing about the identity and access management space is like it keeps going, it's like a balloon keeps going in and out, is that you start getting all these new capabilities, everybody's building them, and now it creates a new space for something else to make sense of all of it for you.
Just make sure you stay out of the trough of disillusionment.
Yeah, well, I mean that's the best you can hope to be.
I feel like we got pretty heavy and pretty deep into the murky, sometimes waters of third party risk. Why don't we swim up to the surface a little bit? How's that for a segue? And then on a little bit of a lighter note, what I'd like to know from you, Jen, and then we'll go to Jim, is what is the most underrated thing about where you live? So, Jen, for you living in Colorado, what is something that's underrated that people just wouldn't get?
Surprisingly, summer. I mean, it's kind of an obvious answer, but summertime. I think every time, I anybody hears that I live in Colorado, they're, "Oh, are you a big skier? You like winter sports? You do this and that." And most people, I think, if they visit Colorado, they come for that sort of thing. But I live for summertime in Colorado, and I'm always shocked that more people don't get out here to enjoy it.
Jim, what about yourself in Georgia?
I'm actually in Augusta, Georgia, which some people who kind of know Augusta will call it Disgusta. And that's because I think that's because they built the airport right where there's like a paper factory and a sewage processing factory. So a lot of times when people have their first exposure to Augusta, they get hit with this stench at the airport. But it's really not a disgusting place. Um, and the thing I was going to bring up is probably something that most people know about Augusta, which is that it's the home of the Masters Golf Tournament. But it's just like there's several cities around the country that are like this, so like Sturgis, South Dakota, Augusta, Georgia, Daytona Beach, where 1 week a year it's the place to be in the United States or maybe in the world. I mean, the whole world descends on Augusta for the Masters Tournament, and so you get all kinds of people there, people visiting here the same week. And, if you do decide that you want to be away for the week, you can usually rent your house out for like $10,000. So that's kind of cool too.
Sounds like a good business opportunity to have like an Airbnb or something that you rent out for that time period. So I'm in Illinois, a little bit outside of Chicago. Um, I would say the most underrated thing about where I'm at is the location. I can get anywhere almost in the world on one flight. So it is super easy to kind of live in a hub city where, it's probably a sneaky underrated thing because you have to deal with the traffic to get to the airport and then O'Hare, which is, typically one of the most busy airports in the world. But there's nothing that beats the convenience of saying, "Hey, I'm going to fly to Seattle in a couple of weeks for Authenticate conference in Seattle, and it's going to be nonstop for me." Poor Jim, he's got to hop on a couple planes. Jen, I think you live, kind of close to Denver, I believe. So, that's another pretty big hub.
It
But I
is.
enjoy being able to get anywhere relatively quickly and relatively easily.
I would have to, second that about Denver. It's definitely a very great place to be. I am still an hour 15 or so from the airport. Now, the downside of the Denver airport is it's basically in Kansas. But I don't know if you guys have flown into Denver airport and had to go anywhere from that airport, you know what I'm talking about. It's definitely way out there.
Unfortunately, I don't have a good Denver story. It's not a good Denver story because it was like the site of my worst ever company presentation thing that I've ever done for my job. I will save that and tease that. If you're interested in hearing about that, I guess send me a note on LinkedIn. I'll talk about it in a future episode. But I got that out of the way with my CEO sitting next to me. So that was awesome times for sure. All right. So let's go ahead and leave it for this week. Before we wrap up, I want to pass it around the room, cutting her virtually. What are some things that people listening to this should be taking away from the conversation around third-party risk, how identity plays into that? Jen, you go first, and then we'll go to Jim.
I think the biggest takeaway is start thinking about it, start considering it. Don't get scared of hearing the term third party risk and think that it doesn't apply. Just start to read up on it, understand what it is, and I think it'll be very clear how it can and should apply to identity security.
Knowing is half the battle. G.I. Joe. How about you, Jim?
I think the IT world has changed so much in the past decade. Most organizations now have some kind of risk function within the organization. I think those are great folks to partner with to start to put together a picture of the landscape of risk, and third-party risk should definitely be a part of that calculus. And it can be a pretty big driver, I think, in helping to justify the business case for your IAM program. So, I guess the takeaway there is, look to partner with that risk function. It'll bring more legitimacy to the business case that you're putting together.
Yeah, good points. I appreciate it. Jen, thank you so much for joining us. And in the show notes, we're going to have a link to Jen's LinkedIn profile. I'm sure she'd be happy to connect with you. I'll just say it on her behalf without even asking her for permission.
Absolutely.
I'll have good. I'll have a link to the IDSA article blog that she wrote around the importance of an authoritative identity source. And for folks who want to check out SecZetta, right? They are there for a reason. They solve an issue that we see a lot. You can find out more about them at SecZetta.com, SecZetta. And with that, we're going to go ahead and leave it for this week. You can always check out the show online at identityattthecenter.com. You can hit us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. And if you've got suggestions, comments, feedback, whatever it may be, you can always connect with Jim and I on LinkedIn. And don't forget to share the show with friends, enemies, we don't care. Rate it, write a review. All that stuff helps us get great guests like Jen and continue the conversation and keep the ball moving from an IAM perspective. So with that, we'll go ahead and leave it for this week. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll talk with everyone in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityattthecenter.com.